inspection of a boat, installation and proper setup of an outboard, and on-the-water testing. Whether you're rigging a boat yourself or selling a package rigged by someone else, this information must be considered to ensure a quality job and a satisfied customer. You can prevent many problems by simply making sure the boat and outboard are rigged correctly. Depending on the situation, you may have to perform very little of the assembly work described. However, all of the work described must be verified during the required pre-delivery inspection. Refer to the appropriate Installation and Pre-Delivery Guidelines booklet for the outboard. On lower horsepower models, refer to the Operator's Guide for installation instructions. Refer to the manufacturer's certification plate for the maximum load and horsepower capacities. For satisfactory performance, the outboard's horsepower should be no less than 70% of the boat's rated horsepower. The total horsepower of the outboards must never exceed the maximum stated on the certification plate. For proper operation, be certain the outboard's shaft length matches the boat's transom height. The model number indicates the shaft length of the outboard. Generally, the anti-ventilation plate should align with the bottom of the hull. Many V-hulls perform well with the anti-ventilation plate approximately 1 inch above the bottom of the hull. The final height location can be determined when water testing the outboard. If you're installing the outboard, refer to the appropriate Installation and Pre-Delivery Guidelines booklet. On lower horsepower models, refer to the Operator's Guide for installation instructions. Before proceeding, read all installation information. This includes information in the Installation Guidelines, Operator's Guide, the new engine pre-delivery checks section of the service manual, and any instruction sheets that came with the accessories. If the boat is being repowered, the entire fuel system should be inspected for deterioration, which could result in leakage or restrictions. At the time of delivery, inspect the shipping carton and the outboard for damage. Make a note of any damage on the bill of lading and report it to the carrier. Check the outboard for loose parts or connections. A single outboard should be mounted on the boat's centerline. To accurately determine the centerline, refer to the installation guidelines. Dual engines must be an equal distance from the boat's centerline. The guidelines also specify a minimum spacing between twin outboards. Once the location of the outboard is determined, drill the 4 mounting holes using a transom drill fixture. Be sure the alignment indicators on the fixture are aligned with the transom centerline. Certain items, such as the steering and gear case speedometer pickup hose, should be attached before the outboard is bolted to the transom. If the boat has a steering cable, extend the ram. Lubricate the ram and inner core with triple guard grease. Attach the steering link to the proper hole in the steering arm. Tighten the fasteners to the specified torque. Use the mounting hardware supplied with the outboard to secure it to the transom. Before installing the bolts, apply a sealant designed for use below the waterline. The bolts must be long enough to allow full engagement of the lock nuts. Tighten the hardware to the torque specified in the service manual. The remote control must have a start-in-gear prevention feature for the safety of the operator, passengers, and anyone else near the boat. The remote control must provide adequate shift-stroke travel to allow for full engagement of the gears. Refer to the appropriate service manual for the required shift-stroke dimension. The type of remote control and key switch will determine the location and configuration of the emergency stop switch and safety lanyard. This is an important safety feature that can reduce the risk of personal injury or death if the operator falls away from the controls or out of the boat. If an emergency stop feature is not included with the remote control, a switch must be mounted near the helm. The steering cable, control cables, and the main harness must be secured to the boat and protected from chafing, cuts, and other damage. All cables, harnesses, and hoses should be routed together from the entry point of the splash well into the outboard's lower motor cover. Correct control cable length and routing are essential for proper operation. A typical transom-mounted outboard requires a 12-inch diameter cable loop. Verify proper clearance of the routing at all possible combinations of tilt angles and steering positions. The installation guidelines provide specific throttle and shift cable installation instructions for different models. The throttle and shift cables must be identified before installation. When the remote control is in neutral, the throttle cable should be retracted and the shift cable should be partially extended. Lubricate both cable guides with triple guard grease. Attach and adjust the shift and throttle cables following the installation guidelines. Make sure the control handle is not obstructed and the cables are not binding through the full range of travel. Lubricate electrical connectors with electrical grease. Make sure to snap the connectors together securely. Position the connectors in a dry, protected area. Each outboard must have its own starting battery. The battery must meet or exceed the requirements for the outboard. The battery must be securely mounted in a protected location. The battery cables supplied with the outboard are used in a typical installation. Some installations may require different battery cables. Refer to the installation guidelines for the proper gauge cable. When using the threaded stud on marine-style battery posts, first install a star washer, then the battery cable, followed by any accessory cables. Install a flat washer and securely tighten it with a hex nut. Do not use wing nuts. Coat the battery terminals with triple guard grease to prevent corrosion. If the battery is not enclosed in a battery box, a terminal insulator must be used on the positive terminal. If terminal clamps are supplied with the outboard, they must be used. Battery selector switches are useful in some applications. Be sure to use marine-rated switches of a make-before-break design. This means they connect the outboard to a second battery before breaking contact with the first. Evinrude outboards with direct injection may be equipped with a built-in battery isolator for charging an accessory battery. Refer to the service manual for wiring instructions. Other outboards may be able to use an external battery isolator. Refer to the instructions that come with the isolator. The oil tank must be mounted in a dry, protected location. Follow the installation instructions supplied with the tank. If a remote oil fill is used, make sure water will not enter the vent of the fill cap. Excess oil supply and/or return hose can be removed to avoid restricting oil flow. Leave the oil tank empty until you are ready to test the low oil warning circuit. Locate and identify the fuel and oil hoses on the boat and outboard. Fuel hoses, primer bulbs, and clamps must be the proper size to prevent a fuel flow restriction at high speed. The fuel and oil supply hoses must be purged before connecting them. We'll cover this procedure later in this module. The hoses must not bind or kink when turning or tilting the outboard. The arrows on the primer bulbs indicate the direction of flow. A water-separating fuel filter may also be mounted inside the boat. It must be mounted to a rigid surface above the full level of the tank and accessible for servicing. The filter must meet or exceed the fuel flow requirements of the outboard. Before performing the water test, the following checks and adjustments should be completed. Turn the steering wheel lock to lock at various tilt positions, from full trim in to full tilt up. Make sure the steering cable, control cables, main harness, and fuel system components will not be damaged when the outboard is in any position. Also, make sure they will not hamper the outboard's travel. Verify the outboard turns the correct direction in relation to the movement of the helm. If the boat has hydraulic steering, check for free play at the helm. If you feel free play, you may need to bleed air from the steering system. Follow the helm manufacturer's instructions and specifications. Even if you don't have to bleed the system, always check the fluid level. Make sure the battery is completely charged. Check to see that nothing is drawing current when all switches are off. Be sure the battery cable connections at the outboard and battery are clean and secure. All Evinrude and Johnson 75 through 250 horsepower outboards require a 6-pulse or 12-pole tachometer setting. Adjust the dial on the back of the tachometer to the required setting. Turn the key switch to the on position and listen for the horn to beep. On models equipped with the System Check engine monitor, the warning horn should sound a short beep, and the gauge should run through a self-test routine. If the oil tank has not yet been filled, the low oil warning light should turn on. Turn off the key and add 1 gallon of the recommended oil for the outboard. Now, when you turn the key back on, the low oil warning light should not come on. If the warning system is not operating properly, find and correct the problem before operating the outboard. To purge the oil system on direct injection models, remove the inlet oil fitting from the oil injector and use a suitable container to catch the oil. Squeeze the oil supply primer bulb until oil flows without any air bubbles. Reinstall the inlet oil line. Squeeze the oil primer bulb one more time to move oil through the oil injector. The oil distribution manifold must be purged when first starting the engine. Use a hose pincher or pliers to clamp off the oil return line and restrict the return oil flow. This forces oil through the manifold and fills the lines to the power head. Wait 15 to 20 seconds before releasing the restriction. To purge the oil system on carburetor models with oil injection, remove the oil supply line at the pump. Use a suitable container to catch the oil. Squeeze the oil supply primer bulb until oil flows without any air bubbles. When proper oil flow is observed, plug the end of the oil supply hose. Leave it plugged for now. This will allow you to check the no oil warning when you first start the engine for the water test. On 4-stroke engines, fill the crankcase with 4-stroke outboard break-in lubricant. The oil level should be at the full mark on the dipstick. After the outboard has been started and run for the first time, recheck the oil level. Add oil as required to bring the level between the add and full marks. While the outboard is in the vertical position, check the fluid in the gear case. Remove the upper gear case plug. The fluid level should be at the bottom of the threads. If it isn't, fill the gear case. If the outboard is equipped with power trim and tilt, operate the trim system and observe the trim gauge for proper operation. Most power trim equipped models work best with the trim limiter rod in the hole nearest the transom. Check for interference between the outboard and the motor well at the full tilt-up position. If the outboard is equipped with fast-track trim and tilt, adjust the tilt limit switch to prevent contact with the motor well at full tilt. Check the fluid level, following the procedure in the operator's guide. Add fluid if needed. On manual trim models, check the angle adjusting rod. The rod should usually be in the middle hole. On-water testing will be necessary to determine the best position. The calibration of the throttle position sensor, or TPS, must be checked on certain models. This is particularly important when aftermarket controls, especially foot throttles, are used. Use the current diagnostic program's dynamic information screen to verify the TPS reading. Place the control handle in neutral. Verify the throttle linkage is against the idle stop. The TPS cal field should indicate 0%. If your reading is not 0%, turn the key switch off and on until a reading of 0% is obtained. Remove the spark plug leads. While turning the propeller shaft, shift the control handle into forward gear full throttle position. The TPS cal should read from 96 to 99% when the linkage and throttle cable adjustments are correct. Now bring the control handle back to the neutral position. Verify the TPS cal reading is 0% and that no TPS out-of-range codes have been set. Fill the fuel tank with the recommended fuel. Refer to the operator's guide for required octane rating. Depending on the type of engine, you may be required to add varying amounts of two-stroke lubricant to the fuel. Place the end of the fuel supply hose into a suitable container. Squeeze the fuel primer bulb or activate the boat-mounted electric primer until fuel starts to flow from the hose. Connect the fuel line to the proper fitting on the outboard. Use the primer to fill the fuel system. Continue priming momentarily to pressurize the system. Check for any leakage on the outboard or in the boat. Repair any fuel leaks, and test again. Propellers are crucial to engine life and optimum performance. Choose a propeller that will allow the engine to run at the midpoint of its operating range with a typical load in the boat. Use the propeller selection guide or the boat builder's recommendation as a starting point. An on-the-water test is the only way to be sure the correct propeller is installed. The owner's packet includes all the necessary propeller installation hardware. Install the propeller following the procedure in the operator's guide. The boat should be water tested before it is delivered to the customer. This is the best way to evaluate the performance and verify the correct operation of the boat and outboard. Install any drain plugs. Launch the boat. Tie it securely to a dock to prevent movement. Use an accurate shop tachometer for the water test. Accurate readings are essential. If the boat has a tachometer, compare the readings. On carburetor models with oil injection, if the oil supply hose is not connected to the outboard, the no oil warning can be checked. Start the engine. After the System Check engine monitor has performed its self-test, the no oil warning light should turn on. Stop the engine. Connect the oil supply hose with the appropriate clamp. Squeeze the oil primer bulb one time to move oil to the fuel and oil pump. Start the engine. This time, the no oil warning light should not turn on, indicating proper flow of oil to the pump. Be sure to check for any leaks before continuing with the water test. Run the engine between 1200 and 1500 RPM. It's a good idea to put some time on the engine before running it at wide open throttle. Check for proper water pump operation by looking at the discharge from the indicator. If water is not discharging, stop the engine immediately to prevent damage to the power head. Inspect for fuel leaks with the outboard running. Repair any leaks before proceeding with the water test. Shift the control handle into forward gear and turn the engine off. Now, try to start the outboard. The starter should not operate. Repeat the test in reverse. Again, the starter should not operate. The engine must start only when the control handle is in neutral. Tiller models can also be equipped with start-in-gear protection. Be sure the start-in-gear protection system is operating properly. Check the emergency safety lanyard. With the engine running, pull the lanyard. The engine must stop. If it does not, the emergency stop switch must be repaired before proceeding with the water test. With the engine running, check the operation of the gauges and other accessories. Continue to monitor the gauges and accessories during the water test. An outboard should warm up to the thermostat's rated temperature after a few minutes of running. Verify the proper engine temperature by performing the engine temperature check as described in the service manual. Frequently monitor the engine temperature throughout the water test. Do not allow the temperature to exceed the recommended operating range. Correct idle speed of the outboard is essential for proper control and shift functions. Once the engine has reached its operating temperature, untie the boat from the dock. Shift the outboard into forward gear. Verify the engine RPM at idle using a shop tachometer. Consult the service manual for specifications and adjustments procedures. Verify the control handle moves easily into both forward and reverse and throughout the throttle range. After the engine's been operated at various throttle settings, briefly accelerate to full throttle and check the engine RPM. Remember, at this point, the engine has just begun its break-in period. Do not operate the engine for more than 1 minute at full throttle, or you could damage the power head. The propeller should allow the engine to run near the midpoint of the recommended full throttle RPM operating range with a normal load in the boat. If you have less than the normal load, for instance, fewer people or less gear than the customer will have, the outboard should run near the top of the RPM range. Power trim models should be checked with the outboard trimmed at the middle of the trim range. Accelerate the boat onto plane several times. Check performance at various angle adjusting rod positions or power trim positions. If the boat is hard to steer or pulls excessively in one direction, the trim tab may need adjustment. Refer to the operator's guide for the trim tab adjustment procedure. Clean the entire boat and outboard before delivery to the customer. If the boat is being delivered on a trailer, verify clearance between the bottom of the outboard and the ground. If it is less than 12 inches, use the outboard's built-in trailering bracket or an accessory bracket. Make sure the trailer lights operate properly. Check the air pressure in the tires. Don't forget the spare. The operator's guide should be given to the owner at the time of sale. The customer is more likely to read it when they're anxiously waiting to take delivery of their new boat. When delivering the boat, review the guide with the customer and ask if they have any questions. Recommend that anyone who will operate the boat read the guide first. Explain the importance of following the break-in procedure. Give the new owner an on-water demonstration. Advise the owner to monitor the gauges and be alert for any change that could signal a problem. On oil-injected models, show the owner the oil level mark on the oil tank. Tell them not to switch to unmixed fuel until the engine break-in is completed and the oil level drops, indicating the pump is working. Advise the owner to bring the outboard back for inspection after 10 hours of operation. Complete all required paperwork, including the warranty registration card, the dealer's customer record, and the owner's identification card. The warranty registration can be submitted online or mailed. Your careful and thorough installation, inspection, and test running of a new outboard are the most important steps in guaranteeing your customer will be satisfied.